So a few months ago, I was minding my own business at home, hanging out, when I got a very interesting email. And that's an email from Hasselblad asking to collaborate and shoot with their Hasselblad X2D, this beautiful little camera that I'm holding right here. So obviously I said yes to that email. And since then, I've been shooting like crazy with this camera between Thailand and Bali, shooting portraits, still life, street photography, landscapes, whatever it is, you name it. And I definitely have some thoughts on this camera. But shooting with this camera also made me think about a much larger question, which is what makes a camera great? What are some of the features that a camera needs to have to be considered great? And is this camera as good as so many people say it is? So in this video, yes, I want to talk about this specific beautiful camera and show you guys a ton of images that I've been shooting over the last few months, but also talk about this larger idea of why a camera might be great for one person, but not so much for another. So I was just wandering around out here and I stumbled across this abandoned guest house. Well, I guess it's under construction, but it's right on the ocean. Look at this view. Oh my gosh, bro. So I've lived in Bali for 5 years now, and there's one thing that never gets easier, and that is the heat. It is so incredibly hot out here. I am sweating profusely. But it's worth it because it's absolutely stunning, especially here at Bingen Beach. We have these gorgeous cliffs leading down onto the ocean and a ton of different perspectives that we can capture from up above as well. And I think it's the perfect place to be shooting with the Hasselblad, which is all soaking wet from my sweat, by the way. So hopefully it'll be okay. Now, first things first, you can't talk about the Hasselblad X2D without first talking about its design, because this camera is absolutely beautiful. It's handmade in Sweden and everything about it just feels intentional. From the entire body that was milled with one piece of aluminum to the engraved Hasselblad logo, this beautiful orange button on the top, and just the shape and the Scandinavian design of it is so gorgeous. And not only that, in the hand, it feels incredible. Just the weight, the balance, the grip, the ergonomics of this camera is definitely better than any other camera that I've used. And paired with the design, this thing is absolutely stunning. And I think most people would definitely agree with that. But the design of the camera only means so much. And of course, as photographers, the most important thing for us is the image quality, the shooting experience. What kind of images are you going to get out of a camera like this? And as you probably know, this has a 100 megapixel medium format sensor. This thing is absolutely gigantic. And the images that you get from this camera are also gigantic. They're about 212 megabytes each, which means you have a ton of information that you can edit when you're working with these files. The files are absolutely stunning and they're a joy to work with. You can do so much to them because you have all of that raw data in there. So I definitely enjoyed editing some of these files, but that medium format sensor has other benefits as well. And the first one that I noticed that really stood out to me was the depth of field. That bigger sensor is just going to present a much shallower depth of field, especially if you're shooting at the maximum aperture on this lens, which is f2.5. Everything just fades into this beautiful, soft, out of focus bokeh. And I am a huge fan of shooting with this particular lens wide open. And speaking of this lens, this is the 55V, which is about a 43 millimeter equivalent. And if you guys have been watching the channel for a while, you know I love shooting with a 35 millimeter lens. And this is actually a really nice change. I've really enjoyed shooting just a little bit more zoomed in compared to 35 millimeters. And that allows me to kind of pull the background in a little bit. It adds a little bit of compression to the shot, which looks incredible, especially for things like portraits or landscapes where you want things that are far away to appear nice and big. And I have really enjoyed shooting with this focal length, and it makes me think maybe I need to switch over to 40 or 43 millimeters because I've definitely fallen in love with that full frame equivalent of 43 millimeter focal length. Now the lens is also ridiculously sharp and it can definitely resolve all of those 100 megapixels. And one of the first things that I did, like so many people that pick up this camera for the first time, was go out, shoot a photo, and then crop in ridiculously far to see how much resolution you actually have in that image. And yeah, the rumors are true. I mean, this thing is a beast. You have so much data in that file to zoom in on and still maintain a sharp image. And that creates a lot of flexibility in the creating process because you have all of that flexibility after you take the shot. And sometimes you might take a photo that absolutely sucks, but with a good crop, you can eliminate distracting elements and you can just create a much more interesting and dynamic composition. So this camera will definitely bail you out in a situation where you didn't completely nail the shot, which is definitely a nice to have. But it's also worth noting that if you do misfocus and you're shooting with a wide aperture like f2.5 and you zoom in, those imperfections are going to show even more. So you do have to make sure that if you are going to crop into that image, you better nail focus. Otherwise, those imperfections are going to really show in that photo. A few other things that I love about this camera: the internal 1TB SSD is a game changer. More camera brands need to be doing this because it is such a lifesaver. If you do forget your SD card, you have that internal storage that you can rely on. I also love the crop modes on this camera, specifically the X-Pan mode, which looks absolutely incredible, but I do think it would look better with a wider angle lens. At 43mm, you do kind of need a very wide, expansive landscape for that X-Pan photo to look good. But if you were shooting with something like a 20mm lens on this, that would look epic with that X-Pan mode. So I definitely want to look at maybe getting a wider angle lens for this camera so I can take advantage of it. Now, I also love that you can easily switch between autofocus and manual focus directly on the lens, and it's super smooth. You can also declick the aperture, which is really nice. And lastly, the menu system is incredibly easy to use. It's super simple, which is really nice in an era where camera systems are absolutely crazy and there's all these different settings that you have to adjust just to take a photo. It's nice to have a very simple and streamlined menu setup. Now, all of those things sound great, but how does this camera actually shoot? Because ultimately that is the most important thing. And this is where you might start running into some of the downsides of this camera. And the first thing I noticed when shooting with the Hasselblad X2D is this is not a fast camera by any means. Because the sensor is so big and the sensor is recording so much data every time you take a picture, it's going to take a long time for the camera to process all of that data. And thus this camera maxes out at 3.3 frames per second. Now, to be honest, that's not something that I care about all that much. I'm not often shooting in burst mode anyways. And for a lot of scenarios, you really don't need to have a high burst rate camera in order to capture the shot. But I did find that the autofocus on this camera slowed me down quite a bit as well. This camera only has single shot autofocus. And as a photographer that likes to use back button autofocus paired with continuous autofocus, well, there is no continuous autofocus on this camera. So if you have a subject and you lock focus and they move a little bit closer to you or a little bit further from you and you're shooting with a wide aperture, well, your subject is going to be out of focus. So you have to be very intentional and careful with this camera if you're using autofocus, and make sure that your subject doesn't adjust their depth before you actually click the shutter button. Now, you can easily switch this camera to manual focus, and I know a lot of photographers that do use this camera in autofocus because the autofocus is so smooth, and there's a few different features that you can use to make manual focusing easier. I was using the focus peaking, which looks really good, and it's pretty easy to make sure that you're focusing on the eye of your subject, for example. But the autofocus on this camera is fine. It's totally good enough if you don't have moving subjects, and it's going to keep up in a lot of scenarios, but it is not going to be nearly as fast as a full frame camera, a modern full frame camera, which has all of the new autofocus modes. So that is something to think about. And of course, I think it's also worth noting that this camera doesn't have any video features at all. This is a photography specific camera. So if you are a hybrid shooter and you want to make a video or even have the option of making a video, you can't do that with this camera. And in short, this camera is actually incredibly simple. It really doesn't do a whole lot, especially when you compare it to a lot of the other modern full frame cameras that are coming out right now. But what it does do, it does incredibly well, arguably the best. And all of the downsides that I just listed about this camera could be considered positives in some people as well. Maybe you crave that slower, art-focused, intentional shooting experience, and you don't want a massive menu full of features that are going to distract you from the most important thing, which is capturing beautiful images. In which case, this would be a great camera, maybe even the best camera that you could have. But if you're someone that wants a Swiss Army knife of a camera, you want to be able to shoot photos, videos, you want all of the modern autofocus features, and you just want a camera that can do it all, well, this camera is probably not going to be for you. And I think that's the point of this video. A great camera is going to entirely depend on what your goals are as a creative. And a camera that's great for you might not be great for somebody else. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you have to buy this camera because it's the greatest and the best camera in the world. It's not, because that's subjective and entirely dependent on what you need and want from a camera. But what I can say is that this camera is hands down one of the best photography specific cameras in the world because it does that one thing incredibly well. It takes gorgeous, high resolution images that feel real, and the shooting experience feels just as premium. And that's why I think this camera is perfect for very intentional, art focused, or project based photography work. It's also great for commercial photography, still life photography, landscape photography. It really does excel in a lot of environments, but it's not going to be a Swiss Army knife, and I think that's what it's going for. If you're shooting in a slightly more controlled environment where things aren't moving quickly and speed isn't really an issue, this camera is going to excel. And there was a lot of situations where I was out shooting with this camera where I would definitely choose this camera over my Sony. Can it keep up when you're shooting something like street photography? Yeah, it can keep up, but you might miss a few shots because it's not going to be nearly as fast as a full frame camera. But that's the point. This camera wasn't necessarily created for fast moving environments. It's streamlined, it's focused on one thing, which is capturing the highest quality images possible, and that is very useful for a large amount of photographers. And because this camera isn't blazing fast, it actually forced me to slow down a bit, and that's something that I've really struggled with ever since I got my Sony a1 II, because that camera is ridiculously fast, and it's actually difficult to slow down with that camera. So this almost forced me to slow down and think about my scenes a little bit deeper, and I ended up walking away with more better photos. Yes, I'm capturing less photos when I'm out and about, but the photos that I am capturing are better than the photos that I would get with my Sony. So I just wanted to share my thoughts on this camera. It really is a beautiful camera, and I think it's a little bit misunderstood. I often hear people saying, oh, this is the best camera that you can buy, but I think it's always important to remember that the best camera for you is not necessarily the best camera for somebody else. But I am looking forward to shooting a lot more with this camera going forward. This is definitely a camera that I would use if I was putting together a project, and I do have some project ideas for when I move out to Spain later this year. I do want to pick up a wider angle lens for this camera because I do want to experiment with that X-Pan mode. It looks so cool, and I think it would be nice to have a little bit more real estate on the sides of the frame to get a wider angle shot using that X-Pan mode. But if you guys have any specific questions about the Hasselblad X2D, drop them in the comments below, whether it's about the lens, the camera, the shooting experience, or whatever. Let me know in the comments. I'd be more than happy to respond and reply to all of those questions. But with that, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and enjoyed some of the photos that I shot with this beautiful little camera, and I will catch you guys again very soon in the next one.